My name is Juliet and I have been writing for 20 years. As Juliet McKenna, I write epic fantasy, swords and sorcery, wizards, dragons, battles, and I've been doing that for a long time. And recently I've thought it was time for a change, so I have started writing modern fantasy books set in England, in the English countryside, with tree spirits and lake spirits and unexpected happenings in old country houses. And these unexpected things are happening to a very ordinary man. He's a carpenter, he's a workman, he goes from place to place and helps build things. But he does know there is more to life than most people see because his mother is a tree spirit. His father's just another ordinary working man, but his mother is a tree spirit. So he finds himself, there is a figure that you see across Europe, the Green Man. And the Green Man communicates with Daniel and sends him places where things need sorting out. So those are the new fantasy books. I also write as J.M. Alvey, and these are detective novels set in ancient Greece. Because when I was a student, I studied classics, Roman and Greek, history and literature at university in Oxford. And I've always been fascinated by history. It's fed into a lot of my epic fantasy writing. I also am a great crime fiction fan. I have been reading some excellent Swedish crime fiction for many years. And I thought about writing crime fiction. I thought, yeah, there are some wonderful books set in ancient Rome. Why not write some crime fiction set in ancient Athens, between the Persian and the Peloponnesian Wars, between Herodotus and Thucydides? Very, very interesting period, lots of things happening in Rome, and the one definitive history of the period has been lost. So that gives a writer a lot of scope to invent things. You have to get your facts right, but you can also invent a great many things. And my hero in these books is a playwright. He writes comedy plays for the great festivals, and he dreams of being famous, so it's very inconvenient when you come back from a rehearsal and there's somebody with their throat cut on your doorstep. So he has to find out who the dead man is and why. And of course, there's no police force, there are no detectives, but there are vengeful gods who expect a murdered man to be avenged. So, and then they take the play to Corinth, and they're meeting a local man who is to be their guide, their fixer, and he's poisoned on their first night in Corinth. So again, Philocles really does need to find out what's going on, and there are no detectives and there is no police force. And in Corinth, there are very rich and wealthy men who run the city, because Corinth is not a democracy at this point. It's very interesting coming back to the classical world, because I was a student 30 years ago. And so I can't rely on what I learned at university 30 years ago. I've had to get a library card and go back to the Bodleian Library. I live just outside Oxford, so I can reach the university library and find out all of the things that have been discovered, the way that thinking has changed, the way that archaeology and classical scholarship work together now is completely different to the way it was when I was a student. As an undergraduate, archaeologists were strange people digging things up in trenches. Classical scholars read books. You very rarely met in the middle. Now that's completely different. The scientific aspects of archaeology have opened up so many new facts, so many new possibilities. Though what that does mean is you have to make sure, if you're inventing something, you have to know what you don't know, and that can be extremely difficult. We know that plays that were put on in the Dionysia were taken to other Greek cities. Who paid the bills? Why did they go? Did all of the actors go and the chorus? So I had to do a lot of research into things like that. And you can find out a lot, but I couldn't ever find out who paid the bills until I found a research paper online, which said, "We do not know who paid the bills." Ah, wonderful. And it's, I go to the university library. 30 years ago, there was a massive card index file, and you had to leaf through all the bits of paper to work out which book was on which shelf. If it wasn't on the shelf, you had to find another book to read. Now it's all electronic. You can sit there with your laptop, you can call up ebook versions of the things you need to read, you can download papers from all of the journals. You don't have to climb wobbly library steps to get a volume off the top shelf of the Journal of Hellenic Studies. Even 5 years ago, I would have struggled to write these books purely from the difficulty of access to the research materials I need. The online scholarship has absolutely transformed how you go about writing books like these. One of the earliest books I remember my mother reading to me and my elder brother as a bedtime story was The Hobbit by Tolkien, and also the Narnia books by C.S. Lewis, and we read these as bedtime stories as children. But when I was growing up, there were a great many books of myths and legends, British myths, Scandinavian myths, from all over the country, all over Europe, and I never saw any distinction. As far as I was concerned, tales of witches and goblins and the history that I was reading and the fantasy that I was reading were all different points on the same spectrum. I was reading writers like Alan Garner, The Weird Stone of Brisingamen. So those were, I suppose, my very early influences. And then I got on to Earthsea, and I started reading a lot of science fiction because my local branch library, we had the children's section and the adult section, and you could not have an adult ticket, and these were cardboard tickets though they were different colours, until you went to secondary school. But by the time I was in my last year of primary school, the nice ladies behind the counter, Mrs. Green and Mrs. Brown, knew that I had read everything in the children's section many times. So we came to a gentlewoman's agreement that I would be allowed into the adult section first thing on a Saturday morning to find science fiction and fantasy, because those books were in the children's library, so clearly they were safe. So that was how I started reading writers like John Wyndham and Robert Heinlein and Asimov and Arthur C. Clarke. And so I read a lot of science fiction as well as fantasy. I've also read many other things, adventure stories, thrillers. If it's got words, I'll read it. But when I came to writing, I was at home with small children, and you have to get details. I've always read a lot of crime fiction. But for a crime novel, particularly a modern crime novel, you've got to get the details right. It's very difficult to go and research how long it takes to change trains in a particular underground station in London if you've got one in a baby sling and one in a pushchair. So I thought, well, if I write fantasy, I can make it up, and as long as it's coherent, as long as the internal logic holds, and I make sure I get all my details right within an imaginary world, that's something I can do from home even with small children. So I started writing fantasy. And my first novel was The Thief's Gamble, and that started the Tales of Aneurin. Stories for me normally start with a question. What if? What if an ordinary working man could see the supernatural? And he has to solve a problem. Daniel is a loner, he travels, he works, and he finds himself a suspect in a murder. And he soon realises that there is a supernatural aspect to the murder which the police are never going to work out. So if justice is going to be done, he's the man who's going to have to do it. With this one, you know, what if a murder happened in ancient Athens? Somebody is found dead on the street. There are no detectives, there are no police force. Who is going to solve that crime and why? With my fantasy novels, again, what if somebody who gets sucked into working for a wizard and trying to solve an ancient mystery, she's an ordinary person with friends and family and not going to be a hero. What if that sort of person gets sucked into these things? So the question always starts with the what if. So I have a question, a challenge for a person, and I will then work out what the answer is. So I have the start of the story, I have the end of the story, and I will then see points on the road that need, well, that's going to have to happen, and that's going to have to happen, and that's going to have to happen. And then that shows me where I have gaps. So I need somebody else so this thing can happen. I need some other people so that thing can happen. So I plot my stories out in advance in a lot of detail. And that will show me what I don't know, like who pays the bills if someone takes a Greek play to a different city. So I then go and do the research to find out what I need to know. And quite often that will change the story, because you'll find something that means that idea you had isn't going to work so well now. Or, well, that idea was okay, but this idea is really good, which does mean I need to change that bit, but that's not a problem. So my plan will expand and get more detailed, and there will be notes scribbled in the margin and different coloured pencils. And then when I have the whole story complete in outline, then I will start writing. So that's my process. I don't know any two writers who work the same way. There is a broad span from people who do a lot of advanced planning like me, through to people who just write chapter 1 and go. It's all a question of finding out what works best for you. And then you need to get fresh eyes. You always need to have fresh eyes on a story. As I say, I've been doing this for 20 years, and I know that I will not get a story right the first time. I will need to find somebody to read it who will say, but I don't understand, if this happens, why does this happen? Or, well, yes, that's really obvious. And that wasn't a surprise because it was far too obvious because of these 3 things that have happened. Possibly if you only need one of those things, then it'll be a surprise. And I've never had a piece of work where somebody else reading it, coming to it fresh, has not improved it. And I hope, I don't imagine I ever will. I will always be wanting input and a new perspective, because I'm so familiar with the story that I know what's going to happen, or my vision of a story, everything's in my head. I need to see it through somebody's eyes that doesn't know everything that I know. I think one of the great things that has happened in recent years is the fact that in English we're getting Swedish crime novels in translation, Swedish fiction in translation, fiction from all across Europe, Italy, the Montalbano stories, because contemporary crime fiction is some of the most detailed and interesting social writing. All of these books, as well as the mystery, as well as the adventure, as well as the puzzle, they are a social record, they're a social document. They are an insight into how other cultures think and what is important to them, and the priorities of different societies. And in an age where people are trying to stir up separation between countries, we are in such a mess in the UK with this at the moment. And I think it's very important that we understand we have far more in common than differences between us. And I think that fiction, and particularly genre fiction with crime fiction, can do so much to help the understanding of one nation with another. And with fantasy fiction, secondary world adventures, like R.J. Barker's books, which are a completely invented world, but you can address issues that people need to think about in fantasy fiction in a way that you can't through other sorts of fiction. One of the series of books that I've written is about a revolution. It's the Chronicles of the Lescari Revolution, and it's about a divided society. Historical grudges have been passed down from generation to generation, and periodically, this breaks out into warfare. Well, my father is Irish and my mother is English. So the version of English history I learnt at school and the version of Irish history I learnt at my grandmother's knee, very, very different. I have friends who lived and worked in Yugoslavia and have subsequently lived and worked in Croatia and Slovenia. I have friends who've been involved in business and diplomacy in Palestine and Israel. Trying to write a modern novel dealing with any of those subjects is so dangerous. It's a challenge for people who live that life. For a writer who is simply looking on, the trouble you would get into, and you could not do it right. But if you write a fantasy series, you write a fantasy novel where this is nothing to do with the real world, but the underlying issues are the same, and you look at how grudges are passed down historically, how misunderstandings arise, how people who want to profit manipulate situations. You can do that in a fantasy novel, and people will think about it, and maybe think when next time they're looking at the news, they'll think, okay. And these wouldn't be people who would necessarily never sit down and read a newspaper or read a detailed government report. So they wouldn't think about things with that sort of material. But you can reach them through fiction. You can explore the real world through imaginary worlds. All of my books are now available as ebooks, so if you want Swords and Sorcery and Wizards and Dragons and Dirty Work at the Crossroads, you start with The Thief's Gamble, and as I say, those are all available online. Those are high adventure. The new books are what happens when the supernatural meets the real world. And it's not nearly as easy as it looks on so many TV shows. Daniel has real problems. So those are, again, adventure and action and the supernatural. And with these books, you're getting a murder mystery, but a murder mystery in a very different world to our own. So there are no police, no detectives, no phones, no clocks. How do you establish an alibi when the most accurate timepiece is a sundial? And there are no fingerprints and there are no forensics. And how do you find out who a dead man who hasn't got a wallet or a driving license or a credit card, how do you find out who he is? So writing detective fiction set in a very, very different world presents all sorts of fascinating challenges for me as a writer, and hopefully will present the same fascination for you as a reader. And also, I have learnt so many fascinating things about the ancient world doing the research for these books. Hopefully the reader will learn a lot more about what we now think ancient Greece was like, as opposed to what they thought ancient Greece was like 30 years ago.